It was the ultimate act of terrorism. Two hijacked planes crashing into the World Trade Center, collapsing what was once one of the tallest buildings in the world, leaving a scene some described as a nuclear winter. Good evening, everyone. It was one of the darkest days in America through the day and into the night, and it is not over. New York and the nation will never be the same. What was once a symbol of America's might is tonight a scene of utter devastation. Piles of rubble, acres of gray ash, a death toll that some estimate could reach into the thousands. Hundreds of rescue workers, very little hope in the rubble of the World Trade Center. And this is the scene tonight at the Pentagon, hit by another hijacked plane shortly after the attack on the World Trade Center. The Pentagon says it does not yet know how many people were killed or injured. President Bush, facing the first and largest crisis of his presidency, one of the largest crises of any modern president, first got word of this attack while he was in Florida today. He then flew to a secure underground bunker near Omaha, the Strategic Air Command headquarters, before returning tonight to the White House and an address to the nation at 8:30. In a brief statement earlier, the president said freedom itself was attacked this morning, and freedom will be defended. Make no mistake, he said, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for what he called these cowardly acts. Tonight, over the next 3 hours, we will be looking for answers to some of the questions we all were asking today. How could this happen? What do we do now? How can we prevent it from happening again? How will it change us? We start tonight with NBC's Campbell Brown, who joins us from near the White House. Campbell?
Tom, the president is now preparing his speech to the nation. Aides tell us it will be a message of resolve and reassurance that our nation has been tested before and has always prevailed. Since Bush arrived here at the White House about 7 p.m. Eastern Time, he has been huddled with his national security team. He did speak with them earlier today when he was in Nebraska by a live teleconference, and this is according to White House aides. He told his team, quote, "We will find these people and they will suffer the consequences of taking on this nation. We will do what it takes. No one is going to diminish the spirit of this country." We are also told by aides that a point he will make tonight is that he wants Americans to return to their lives, to demonstrate that this has not affected the American spirit. This will not diminish the country. Now, Tom, obviously the president's security today was a top priority, and that's why he was shuttled across the country on Air Force One today, as you said, beginning in Sarasota, Florida, where he was first informed, then flying to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. From there, going to Nebraska, to the U.S. Strategic Command Center, where he addressed his national security team, then back to the White House. Aides tell us there is a plan in place when they believe there is a threat to the president, and that today they implemented that plan, moving him around on Air Force One and deliberately not telling us where he would be going at any point in time. They also say that gave the president's national security team, Vice President Dick Cheney and National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, who were here at the White House in the Situation Room, that gave them time to assess the threat, to gather information, and they say it was the president who made the decision to return to Washington to address the nation tonight. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Campbell Brown. There was an exceptional bipartisan appearance on the steps of the Capitol tonight. Members of the congressional leadership, Republican and Democrat, House and Senate, gathered to say that we stand fully behind the president. And then, as Tim Russert was witness to all of this as well, Tim, they broke into God Bless America.
Tom, an extraordinary scene here in Washington. 24 hours ago, rancor, bipartisanship, not tonight. National unity, indeed a new tone in Washington. The notion of a lockbox for Social Security seems so minuscule to people now across the country and even here in Washington. They understand what this has meant. That's why all eyes on the president tonight. Democrats and Republicans have told him, Mr. President, whatever you say, we are behind you.
All right, Tim Russert, we'll ask you to stand by there throughout the evening. We're going to go to the Pentagon now, and our Pentagon correspondent, Jim Miklashevsky, who was on duty this morning when he said there seemed to have been an explosion at the Pentagon. We now know that it was a hijacked airliner crashing into that building. Jim, do we have any sense tonight of the death toll or the casualty list at the Pentagon?
No, it's going to run into the scores. There were more than 60 people on the plane. and an undetermined number of people still buried beneath the rubble here behind us. Searchers have entered the building. They've been in there for about 5 hours now, Tom. There is no exact casualty toll that's been released. They've set up a temporary morgue inside the center courtyard of the Pentagon for tonight. But in the meantime, there was also an expression of resolve here at the Pentagon from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Hugh Shelton, who reaffirmed America's resolve and issued a firm pledge to retaliate against those responsible. And the Pentagon has always had contingency plans to attack a variety of targets of the known terrorist, Osama bin Laden. And we've been told that military planners are taking a close look at those contingencies tonight, Tom.
All right, thanks very much. NBC's Jim Miklashevsky, and joining me now is former Secretary of the Treasury, former Secretary of State, former White House Chief of Staff, James Baker, who was deeply involved, of course, in the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush, the 41st President of the United States during the Persian Gulf War. Obviously, the highest priority must be assigned to finding out who was responsible for this, Mr. Baker, but then describe for us, sketch for us, if you will, in diplomatic terms, what the first steps ought to be.
Well, I think there are a number of steps, Tom, that have to be taken. First of all, we need to look at our intelligence gathering capabilities. We need to look at the security measures and standards at our airports. And then, of course, we do have contingency plans for striking back. There really are not a lot of easy answers in that regard, but we do have contingency plans. All of the administrations I've served have had those plans. This administration has them, and I'm sure they will implement them. And we are pretty good at that kind of operation if we can pinpoint exactly who was responsible for this atrocious series of events.
And do we dispatch special emissaries to the Middle East, to Tel Aviv, also to Riyadh, to Saudi Arabia, to Jordan and the other Arab states there, so that we can get everybody calmed down?
Well, we will probably be doing that, whether it's through the use of special emissaries or not. I don't know. It doesn't have to be special emissaries. I think we ought not to rush too quickly to the judgment here that this happened because there was a lull in the peace process in the Middle East, particularly if it's Osama bin Laden, and that would be my number one suspect. He's been at this for quite some time. He took out our embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. He took out the Khobar Towers, or had some role in it. And so I don't think we ought to draw the connection too quickly between the absence of progress in the peace process in the Middle East and what happened to America today. I think these people that did this have been dead set for a long time on a terrorist attack against America. They've succeeded, unfortunately. It's really rather amazing that they were able to do what they did with respect to the commercial airliners. We haven't had a hijacking in this country, I don't think, of an airliner for over 10 years. So we need to take some careful looks at what happened, exactly what happened, and what we can do to prevent it in the future. Let me just say one final thing. When I was in government at high levels, and I was here for 12 years in Washington, D.C., we foreclosed a lot of similar type attacks that had been planned, maybe not as sophisticated as this one, but we rolled up a lot of operations, and generally speaking, the counterintelligence and counterterrorism capabilities of the United States have functioned very effectively. We may, however, now be entering into a new era, and we may have to see some significant new measures.
But that's my very point. Take it out of the context of what's going on between Israel and the PLO. A lot of the moderate Arab states have been targets for this same kind of fanatic activity as well.
That's correct. And when there is violence in the Middle East, when there is terrorism, the more moderate states, whether they're Arab states or the United States or our allies in Europe, we tend to be diminished, because those who argue for peace and those who support peace are hurt when the rejectionists and the radicals succeed. And that's, of course, what this is. This is success by the radical elements at the very highest levels.
All right, thank you very much. James Baker, former Secretary of State, former Secretary of the Treasury, and, of course, White House Chief of Staff during the Reagan administration, who has seen more than his share of crises. But he was looking out the window of his Washington law office today and looked on in disbelief as he saw smoke billowing up from the Pentagon, not realizing at the moment, of course, that it had been the target of a direct hit by a hijacked airliner. And on board that airliner, by the way, was Barbara Olson, a well-known Washington lawyer. Well, this is the scene in New York tonight. This is a city that is still hurting very deeply. The New York City Firefighters Union says tonight, these are unconfirmed numbers, but it's from the Firefighters Union, that it has lost, and the city has lost, 200 of its finest. 200 firemen killed today in the World Trade Center attack. The buildings came down, of course. Many of those firemen were at the base of those buildings, involved in firefighting and rescue efforts at the time. That's the first number that we've had from a reliable source that comes from the Firefighters Union tonight. Earlier, Mayor Giuliani would only say that he expected the death toll to be horrendous. At one point, they had 1,500 people being treated at Liberty Park, which is at the tip of Manhattan. This will be going on throughout the evening in New York. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager now and see what the very latest is on the hijacking of these 4 planes today, 2 from Boston, 1 from Newark, and 1 from Washington Dulles. Robert?
Tom, there are little glimmers coming out of what may have gone on in the cockpits of some of these planes. The Attorney General John Ashcroft, in his news conference this evening, mentioned knives when he was talking about the first of these planes to be hijacked, the American airliner out of Boston Logan, that was the first to go into World Trade Center number 1. There were several cell phone calls from planes. You mentioned Barbara Olson, the wife of Solicitor General Theodore Olson. She called her husband twice before the plane that she was on, which was one that left Dulles and was bound for Los Angeles, before that plane crashed into the Pentagon. And she mentioned people in the back of the plane with knife-like devices. There was another person who called a relative from a plane and said that the passengers and the pilots of that plane had been herded into the back and that the terrorists were at the controls of the aircraft. We haven't heard guns mentioned yet, but presumably those were weapons too taken aboard, but no one has confirmed that at all at this point. Other cell phone calls monitored from people. There was one unconfirmed report of a flight attendant on that first flight, the Boston flight, who called and said that the crew had been killed and that she'd been locked in the restroom, and then they didn't hear any more from her. Tom?
Thanks very much, NBC's Robert Hager tonight. Robert, let me just catch up with you quickly. Tomorrow, we do expect that air travel will resume at noon Eastern time. But what should travelers expect in terms of security at airports?
Oh, it will be very, very strong, and I'm not sure they'll actually do it at noon Eastern time is what we've heard, but we simply said that there was not going to be, this is the FAA said, any more travel until noon tomorrow, and then they would reassess at that point. So we don't know for sure that they'll resume at noon.
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Robert Hager. This day, it's the 11th of September, the year 2001. Some people have said the 9th month, the 11th day, 911, is a day that will be in bold print in future history books, a day that is a dark mark for this country, a day that everyone will remember where they were when they heard the news. After all, our largest city and most vital financial market immobilized, the country terrorized politically and psychologically. Dateline Stone Phillips tonight takes us through this astonishing day, minute by minute.
Today, the unimaginable happened. At the start of a busy workday, New Yorkers heard an explosion, then looked up to see a symbol of America's economic power, one of the World Trade Center's twin towers, billowing smoke and flames.
Yeah, the glass, just flames exploded out the front of the World Trade Center. Glass flew everywhere.
Minutes later, literally from out of the blue, an even more horrifying sight. A jetliner bearing down on the other tower. It was a direct hit.
A second airplane, a 727, just ran into the building.
Before the hour was out, the symbol of American military power, the Pentagon, was also in flames. It too apparently the target of a new weapon, a passenger jet hijacked and turned into a guided missile. Across the country, shock, sorrow, fear, outrage, and the realization that America was under attack. About 8:45 this morning, the sky over Manhattan was clear following a night of violent thunderstorms. In the city's financial district, the very heart of American commerce, thousands of workers were already at their desks. Moments later, in the upper reaches of the 110-story North Tower, sudden impact.
As Matt just mentioned, we have a breaking news story to tell you about. Apparently, a plane has just crashed into the World Trade Center here in New York City.
1 second after the sound started, there was gray smoke and what looked to be like confetti flying all over the place.
Fire and death above, confusion below, as some 10,000 people streamed out of the building.
There was a lady had a big gash on her head, so it was people stampeding one over top of another.
Witnesses reported a horrifying scene. Desperate people jumping from the burning skyscraper. Bloody clothing and body parts scattered on the streets below. As emergency crews rushed to the southern tip of Manhattan, the immediate thought, could it really be happening again?
Step back, okay?
In 1993, the same building was hit by a truck bomb, Islamic militants hoping to topple the one tower into the other. 6 people died in that attack, and 1,500 were injured. But within the first minutes today, it was clear that the toll this time would be much higher. Then, at 9:03, less than 20 minutes after the first strike, with police and rescue personnel still scrambling to respond, this.
There were many people in the building.
Oh, another one just hit. Something else just hit. A very large plane just flew directly over my building, and there's been another collision. Can you see it? I can see it on this shot.
Live cameras trained on the first stricken tower captured another huge explosion, this one on the South Tower. Only this time, the attack was documented. This indelible image to be replayed again and again, seared into the American memory.
And here it comes right there.
An American Airlines 767 with 92 people on board hijacked on its flight from Boston to Los Angeles, becoming the implement of mass murder. The impact was devastating, the airliner punching through the skin of the huge tower, another rain of glass, concrete, and terror.
It's like this unbelievable ball of fire, and the whole street, which is now awakened, everyone's like, whoa. People start crying, people start running.
It was now clear that this was no accident. The first tower had also been hit by a hijacked passenger jet, a United flight that had also taken off from Boston, bound for LA. The attacks left New York virtually paralyzed. Tunnels and bridges linking the city shut down, subways closed, telephone lines jammed, cell phones overloaded as frantic callers tried to contact loved ones. At 9:30, President Bush, in Florida to talk about education, addressed a nation reeling and in need of reassurance.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
But even as the president pledged to hunt down and punish those responsible, another attack, this one even more audacious. The target, the Pentagon. Another American Airlines jet bound for Los Angeles had been hijacked, this one taking off from Washington's Dulles Airport. It was another direct hit. NBC's Pentagon correspondent Jim Miklaszewski suddenly found himself on the front lines of a war that had come home.
I don't want to alarm anybody right now, but apparently it felt just a few moments ago like there was an explosion of some kind here at the Pentagon.
9:43 a.m. With concern that the White House could be a target, President Bush boarded Air Force One bound for a special secure command post at a military base. At 9:49, the Federal Aviation Administration announced it was shutting down the nation's air traffic. In a world turned upside down, hundreds of passenger planes crisscrossing the country were now potential terrorist weapons.
The Federal Aviation Administration ordered all airports closed, and all planes which were in the air were directed to land at the nearest airport.
This morning, on a scale beyond belief, Americans experienced what it's like to feel truly vulnerable, to realize when someone is willing to die for a cause, we are all potential targets. The number one suspect, this man, Osama bin Laden, a radical Islamic terrorist linked to past attacks on American interests. A London-based Arab journalist said today that 3 weeks ago, followers of bin Laden warned of a huge and unprecedented attack on the U.S. Was this it?
Somebody provided the logistical support for this operation, and clearly the only person, or one of the only people, that has built up such a network in the world today is Osama bin Laden.
There was no word from bin Laden, but the Taliban-ruled government of Afghanistan, where bin Laden is based, issued a statement this morning condemning the attacks and saying bin Laden did not have the capability to carry out such acts. And there were plenty of other suspects, ranging from radical Palestinian groups to rogue governments.
President Bush has committed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to identify and bring to swift justice those responsible for these despicable attacks.
While the nation's intelligence community ran down possible suspects and tried to assess whether more attacks were imminent, rescue workers in New York and Washington confronted a disaster of immense proportions. In New York, local hospitals began filling up, urgent calls going out to every available surgeon and nurse, long lines of people outside waiting to donate blood.
It was a war zone. It was just unbelievable.
And still, there was worse to come. At 9:59 a.m., the Trade Center's South Tower, the building that took the second hit, began to crumble. It was almost incomprehensible. In a matter of seconds, the skyscraper collapsed and was gone.
Suddenly, we hear, the security say, "Everyone get out now, now, everyone run for your lives."
NBC producer Shahar Baran was there with a home video camera.
A bunch of women just standing there, shocked. By then, the whole building sort of implodes. It just goes like this. And you see like a side of the building, and then it goes, and there's this ball, this silver yellow ball sort of heading towards you, kind of in slow motion. You can't figure out what to do. People are starting to run like crazy.
If you take a look behind
Then at 10 a.m., news of another passenger plane in trouble. Someone on United Airlines Flight 93, traveling from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco, called 911 and reported a hijacking. Then an explosion and silence. The plane crashed here, some 80 miles outside of Pittsburgh. There were 45 people on board. So far, 3 passenger jets used kamikaze style, and a 4th that might have been. 266 people on board killed. The death toll on the ground still unclear. Then, at 10:30, another sickening sight. The tower still standing, following its twin, collapsing, vanishing in a cloud of smoke. By 11 o'clock, the sense of alarm had spread across the country. Troops standing guard as national landmarks were shut down. Fighter jets actually patrolling the skies as the last airborne passenger planes rushed to safety. 11:14, officials trying to manage the disaster, struggling to describe it all.
First of all, Chief, do we have any idea of how many people are in there?
We have no idea. Now, as you know, it was pretty much rush hour time that this took place this morning, so the numbers we don't know yet. We tried to get almost everybody out that we could early on.
10,000 people in each tower would typically be in there on a normal business day. And we get about another 5,000 visitors during the course of the entire day. So by 8:30, 9 o'clock, the building should have been full.
And New Yorkers were struggling too.
And now they both collapsed. There's no more World Trade Centers.
At 11:42, another plane from Boston declared an emergency. Fearing a bomb on board, it landed in Cleveland. Soon, all planes in Canada as well as the U.S. were grounded. The borders with Mexico and Canada were sealed, and Major League Baseball announced the cancellation of all games scheduled for today. At 1:12, President Bush, at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, again spoke to the nation.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
Moments after his speech, the president reboarded Air Force One for a then undisclosed location. Meanwhile, in New York, an army of rescue workers and volunteers from the city's building trades and other unions made their way to the wreckage of Lower Manhattan, seeking the injured and dead.
You guys going back?
Yes. It's our job.
You worried about that other tower?
Personally, I am. I got fellow officers that might be trapped. I'm not trying to be a hero, but I think if you were in this position, you'd do the same thing.
Those civilians who could made their way by foot across the Brooklyn Bridge, as New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani called for calm in a city that was more shell-shocked than terrified.
And I'd ask the people of New York City to do everything that they can to cooperate, not to be frightened, to go about their lives as normal.
The mayor's news conference gave the first hint of just how high the casualty count could be.
There are over 1,000 rescue workers, probably about 2,000 that are deployed, trying to get into the buildings, trying to find people, trying to search for people. The governor and I spoke a couple of hours ago. The governor has deployed the National Guard to relieve them because our people are going to need reinforcements pretty soon.
Just before 3 p.m., President Bush landed at Offutt Air Force Base outside of Omaha. From an underground bunker at the Strategic Air Command Base, he convened a National Security Council briefing. As 4 o'clock approached, the president's spokesperson, Karen Hughes, briefed reporters back in Washington.
The Secretary of Defense remains at the Pentagon, and the Secretary of State is en route back to Washington.
5:21 p.m., even as people around the country struggled with the enormity of today's events, a third building at the World Trade Center, damaged by this morning's attacks, collapsed.
They advised us to leave because we have...
Oh, my God. Look behind us. Please pan in this way, please. Be careful of your baby. This is it.
That's the building coming down.
Oh, my God. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. No.
Fortunately, the building, with more than 40 floors, had been evacuated. But once again, the concrete canyons of Lower Manhattan were filled with the sounds of sirens and the sight of people fleeing for their lives.
That's Stone Phillips with a riveting account of all that happened today. And what you see behind me is the scene in Lower Manhattan tonight, live as the rescue efforts do continue. So does the fire and the smoke. 3 buildings now have been collapsed as a result of this terrorist attack today. Let's go to NBC's Pat Dawson, who's been on duty there all day long as we await the President of the United States. Pat, very quickly, bring us up to date on recovery efforts.
The recovery efforts at this point, Tom, still pretty much the bottom line is it's a rather chaotic situation here. New York City Fire Department Lieutenant was just giving us some information a few minutes ago and said that there are still fires burning down there, still some underground fires. He told us that there was a rather significant fire in that building that Stone was just describing, number 7 World Trade Center, that collapsed late in the afternoon. As he said, there are still fires burning there. They are trying at this point to get to those fires and to extinguish them, as well as the task, obviously, of looking for anyone who might possibly have survived, although at this point that is a very, very difficult thing to do in the darkness and the smoke and rubble that this fire lieutenant said runs several stories high in there. Just making a point or coming on about a point that you mentioned before, as the New York City Firefighters Union saying that fully half of the firefighters originally responding to the events early this morning were killed. That would fit with information that we had gotten from one of the chiefs who was in charge of that operation, saying that he knew he had lost at least 50 to 60 men and probably far fewer that he was not able to evacuate. Tom?
All right, thank you, Pat Dawson, bringing us up to date on the rescue efforts that continue underway as we look at the scenes that have been described all day long by so many people who were there either as a war zone or reminiscent of a nuclear winter. The President of the United States will address the nation, presumably from the Oval Office tonight, after certainly the most hectic day of his presidency. one of the most difficult days of any modern president. He began in Florida earlier, went to Shreveport, addressed the nation from there at Barksdale Air Force Base, then to the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Omaha, Nebraska, to the very secure bunker with all the most sophisticated communications equipment in the world at his disposal for a meeting of the National Security Council. And then he felt strongly that he wanted to come back to the nation's capital, to Washington, D.C. It was symbolically and politically important for him to address the nation from there tonight, that symbol of freedom and power, the Oval Office of the President of the United States in the West Wing of the White House. We'll be sharing with you after we hear from the President also the appearance tonight on the steps of the Capitol of the House and Senate members who were still in town, Republican and Democrat alike, the leaders. There they are. And after their statement by their leaders, they broke into this spontaneous rendition of God Bless America. NBC's Tim Russert is standing by with me as well. Tim, this is going to be a great test, not just for the president, but for his entire staff and, of course, for the political leadership on both sides on Capitol Hill. Let's go now, Tim. I'm sorry, we'll get to that later. Here now is the President of the United States in the Oval Office. We expect to hear from him momentarily.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you, good night, and God bless America.
President George W. Bush, in his second address to the nation, and certainly the most grave speech that he has made in his very young presidency, as he talked tonight about the terrorists attempting to shatter steel in buildings but not being successful in shattering the steel of resolve in this country, saying the bright light of freedom will continue to burn. He was a sorrowful and sober president, but also one filled with resolve, as he said, we will find the people who are responsible for this and bring them to justice. This has been a long and difficult day for the president, and it's just the beginning because there are many complex decisions that remain ahead of him now. NBC's Tim Russert joins me now from the Washington Bureau, where he is our Washington Bureau chief and moderator of Meet the Press. Tim, the president tomorrow will obviously be sending out a lot of directives to his military, to his law enforcement officers, and also to the people who are responsible for this nation's security at airports and in other places.
Tom, the president cast this tonight as a battle between good and evil, using the word evil several times. Law enforcement officials and intelligence officials hope that with the cockpit recorders, airport records, and perhaps even some celebrations or proclamations by those who did this, they can quickly determine just who must be retaliated against. The president also said something very important, Tom. Whoever harbors these terrorists will be dealt with in the same way as those who committed the terrorism. That is a very important signal and message to people all across the world. Tom, there's a steely resolve in Washington, a passionate determination to bring these people to justice, but there's also a sober realization that our way of life will change forever.
All right, NBC's Tim Russert, who's our Washington Bureau Chief. Tim, we're going to ask you to stand by there tonight. I want to go to Richard Holbrooke now, who has been one of our most skilled negotiators and veteran diplomats. He was obviously deeply involved in the Dayton Peace Accords. He was the man who made that happen and trying to bring some sense of peace to the Balkans. Around the world, Mr. Holbrooke, there seems to be this dividing line between Islamic fundamentalists and the United States, not just in the Middle East, but of course in the central part of Europe and in the southeast part of Asia as well.
First of all, I think it's very important to make clear that when you say Islamic fundamentalists, you're not talking about all people who follow Islam as a religion, and I know you and I share that, Tom. But I agree with what Tim Russert just said. The most important sentence in the president's fine speech, which we've all just listened to and which I think the world should understand the president has spoken for the entire nation, regardless of party. The most important sentence in the president's speech was the phrase, "We make no distinction between those who committed the act and those who harbor the people who committed it." And it is absolutely critical now that the United States rally an international coalition so that we don't go it alone in seeking out these people. If, as you have been reporting, it comes from Osama bin Laden, and if the Taliban have left him in their country, they must suffer the consequences. And we're going to need the support of our European allies, of the Russians, the Chinese, and of the Arab moderate states like Egypt and Jordan, which all must join us in the effort to eradicate this scourge that is upon us. As Tim Russert said, it's going to be difficult. but it is something that we must do with other countries to isolate the people who did it.
Richard, no one knows better than you that that's a daunting diplomatic assignment. The last time that happened successfully, we had a highly conspicuous presence in Saddam Hussein, who had moved into Kuwait, and President George Herbert Walker Bush, this president's father, and his very skilled team did manage to put together an extraordinary alliance. Will it be more difficult this time?
It will be more difficult, Tom, for a reason that's quite clear. We know what the act of war was, and it is an act of war, but not only do we not know exactly who did it, although we have our suspicions, but finding them will be much more difficult than driving an overt, highly visible force out of Kuwait. And we must remember that it took George Bush Sr. 7 long months from August 1st, 1990 until the beginning of 1991 before he launched that military attack. The American public and the world is going to want some kind of action earlier than that, but we'll have to know who it must be directed against. Still, the President's critical statement just now that we'll make no distinction between those who did it and those who are harboring the men who did it is, I think, a big first step towards changing the rules of the game so that people like this can no longer hide behind the kind of horrible behavior that the Taliban have shown in this situation.
Richard Holbrooke, our former ambassador to the United Nations, former ambassador to Germany, a leading State Department authority, and the principal architect of the Dayton Peace Accords for Bosnia. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Tom.
General Norman Schwarzkopf, of course, knows a good deal about putting together an alliance and striking back hard in the Persian Gulf War. He was the commander of the Allied forces there, but this is a far different situation that we face now, General Schwarzkopf.
No question about it. No question about it. But I, just like everyone else, was delighted to hear that statement about going after those people who harbor these terrorists, too. That applies not only to the people abroad, but people in our own country who do that.
General Schwarzkopf, we have the mightiest military in the world, but we are facing an entirely different kind of enemy now. That's very plain today in the pain and grief that this country is feeling. Are we going to have to realign our military forces?
I don't think we need to realign them, Tom. We have the capability to strike. The question we're going to have difficulty with is finding them. Number one, identifying them, and then number two, finding them and being able to attack them where we find them.
Have you been surprised that despite all the warnings about the vulnerability of this country to terrorism, that both among ordinary people and even in the highest echelons of Congress, people have refused in some sense to take it all very seriously?
Well, you know, we've always had those two great oceans on either side of us to protect us and sort of isolate us from the rest of the world, and they've always been a sort of a sanctuary for us. And with the world getting smaller and smaller due to international transportation and that sort of thing, those are no longer walls that protect us anymore. We need to come to the realization, and you know, terrorism has been alive and well throughout the rest of the world for a very, very long time, and you can point to it in many different places, and it's come to our shores big time now. We need to understand that.
I know that you still have many contacts in the Arab world among the moderate Arab states. Do you think that they will be willing to stand beside the United States now in a conspicuous fashion against this kind of terrorism?
That's going to be very, very tough for them to do. Very, very tough, because, of course, in doing so, the terrorists have always justified their acts against any United States facility because of what the United States support of Israel. And quite frankly, for them to stand up now and support the United States 100% is going to put them in a very, very difficult position with vis-a-vis Israel, because most of those states are anti-Israel.
All right, thank you very much, General Norman Schwarzkopf, who's with us tonight as well. Ambassador Richard Holbrooke did make a very appropriate point, because the reaction in this country will be, in many quarters, to lash out at all people of Islamic faith, all practicing Muslims. And there are about 7 million in this country altogether, many of them in the Detroit area, but also throughout the eastern seaboard as well. That would be a grievous error on the part of the United States, because many of these Islamic countries have been the targets of the same kind of terrorism. Egypt particularly, and Saudi Arabia has not been happy with some of the attacks that have been made in that country as well. These are people who operate like loose bands of guerrillas, and they have their own kind of demented and perverted view of what the Islamic faith is all about, and they attempt to gain their revenge against what they describe as their satanic enemies like the United States through these kinds of acts of cowardly terrorism. The Islamic faith is the fastest growing faith in the world, and it's one that cannot be ignored by this country in so many different dimensions. Let's go to NBC's Jim Miklaszewski now, who's at the Pentagon. Jim, we know that American military forces are on worldwide alert of the highest order tonight. Anything else for us?
Well, officials here at the Pentagon also at the highest state of alert, Delta, which is essentially virtually at a war footing, Tom, where American military are supposed to be geared up, weapons locked and loaded, ready for absolutely everything. But it's been a full 11 hours since that American Airlines 757 slammed into the Pentagon, and firefighters are having a very difficult time with the stubborn blaze. As you can see behind me now, what were just a couple of flickers on the roof are actually now full-blown infernos, apparently. Flames bursting through the roof, even more so just in the last few minutes as we've been standing here watching, and much further away now than the original fires that we had watched several hours ago. So it appears that the fires here in the Pentagon are not only stubborn, but spreading. At the same time, television crews were permitted in the area just a short time ago, and they recorded a very grisly scene, Tom. What they first saw were some of the dead that had been removed from the rubble, covered in sheets. There's a temporary morgue actually set up in the center courtyard of the Pentagon here. The exact casualty toll still not known, but scores are believed to be dead and still buried underneath the rubble. And there was also some shots of the damage, exterior damage around the building itself. As you can see from the pictures, it's eerily reminiscent, Tom, of the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City. The wide gash in the building and the slanted floors that had just collapsed under their own pressure, and it appears that these rescue workers are a long way from not only containing the blaze but recovering the victims. Tom,
I find that stunning, Jim Miklaszewski, that they've had all day to work on that blaze, and tells you about the very grievous nature of this attack on that building, that they still have flames at this hour burning through the military headquarters of the United States.
Well, actually, Tom, some consider the location where this plane went in rather fortunate, because exactly where the plane went in was an area that had recently been redeveloped and redesigned with very heavy blast walls and firewalls in that new area there. Of course, can't withstand the kind of impact of a 757. So as you look at the building, the fire did not spread very much to the right, the new portion of the building, and the old portion where the fire continues to spread, much of that had already been vacated. Those offices vacated in preparations of the remodeling effort that was to be undertaken in that section of the building. Even though the death toll here is likely to still rise significantly, the number of dead is probably considerably less than it would have been if this part of the Pentagon had been up to full staff. Tom?
And Jim, a lot of people are going to be looking at all that destruction and wonder whether our military capability is in any way compromised by the damage to the building here.
Well, fortunately, too, this is exactly the opposite side of all the critical command centers in the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense's office, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs office, the National Military Command, the tank. You've been there, Tom, where some of the most critical military decisions are made. Fortunately, they were all on the other side of the building, and Secretary Rumsfeld never left the building today. After surveying some of the damage, actually helping some of the injured out on stretchers, he returned, not to his office, but the National Military Command Center to coordinate any kind of military assessments and operations that may be underway. Tom, one indication that some plans are already being considered. 2 aircraft carriers were recently in the Persian Gulf, the Enterprise, the Carl Vinson. The Enterprise had left the Persian Gulf, was scheduled to leave the area, head home, and the Navy has told, the Pentagon has told the Enterprise, stay right where you are.
Jim, we do know that the Air Force One had a fighter plane escort when it returned today from the Omaha to Washington leg. Do you think that that might be routine for the foreseeable future?
I would guess that probably will be routine. I mean, we saw the extraordinary scene over here earlier today of American fighter jets, F-16, flying low-level cover over the Capitol and the Pentagon. And I think there will be extraordinary security measures, not only implemented around this building, and they had been stiffened just recently, Tom. All the outside windows have been equipped with Kevlar coating to guard against blast. This portion of the building that have been remodeled, heavy blast walls put in. So they were in the process of trying to make this building terror-proof. It was proven today that that may never be possible.
All right, thank you very much, NBC Jim Miklashevsky, who is at the Pentagon tonight. Now let's go to NBC's Andrea Mitchell, who covers the diplomatic front and national security matters for us as well. Colin Powell, is he back in the nation's capital tonight, Andrea?
Yes, he is back. He had cut short his trip to South America, flew directly from Lima, Peru, back to Washington, and is now at the State Department. He went to meetings with his top team. They were waiting there on the 7th floor of the State Department for him, so he came back without going to Bogota, Colombia. But intelligence officials and others are all, as you know, mobilizing to try to find the culprits. U.S. officials have briefed some members of Congress. What we're learning now from Senator Orrin Hatch, who's a key member of the Judiciary Committee, is that they did have intelligence intercepts. So after the attack, they did pick up some intercepts, and you know the sophistication of the National Security Agency and their ability to intercept communications worldwide, and they zero in, they target bin Laden's operation routinely. They picked up intercepts with some members of his organization apparently referring to these targets having been hit. They've been successful in the past building cases against bin Laden by picking up this kind of information, these kinds of communications. They also believe that at least one person on one of the 4 doomed flights may have been a member of his organization. So as disastrous as this is, they will have leads from people checking into airports, checking on those flights. They know some of the pseudonyms, the aliases, the fake identifications that are used by some of these people. They've probably got a pretty good head start tonight. George Tenet and his officials are all gathered at the CIA in secure areas and are having meetings as we speak.
Andrea Mitchell, are you picking up anything about sending emissaries around the world in an effort to build what has been described as an extraordinary coalition of people to try to build an alliance against the idea of terrorism? Because it's not just the Western democracies that are being threatened by all of this, but as you well know, many of the moderate Arab states have been targets as well.
And as Dick Holbrooke and General Schwarzkopf were talking to you earlier, it's very clear that we are at a very weak moment diplomatically in the Arab world and in the Gulf region. Our best allies, including Saudi Arabia, top leaders have been blunt in telling President Bush and communicating privately with his father, who is, of course, very popular in that area, and talking to other U.S. officials about how displeased they are about the situation with the U.S., Israel, and the Palestinians. So there is very little support. Bin Laden is a hero, is in many ways an idol to many people on the street in the Palestinian areas. So while we have to be very careful to make those distinctions with Islamic fundamentalists who have nothing at all to do with Osama bin Laden, to radicals in the region, he is a hero. And he will, of course, be made more of a hero if and when the U.S. retaliates. And as both of your other guests were saying earlier, there is no question in anyone's mind the U.S. is going to retaliate not only against bin Laden, because they don't even know exactly where he is, but most assuredly against the Taliban if they can nail down the evidence that he was responsible, because there's no question that the Taliban have been warned. The U.S. is going to retaliate against Afghanistan itself.
NBC's Andrea Mitchell, thank you very much. Let's go to NBC's Robert Hager now, who covers the aviation beat for us. And of course, today we did have the fully unexpected and shocking development of these terrorists hijacking 4 airliners simultaneously, 2 American Airlines, 2 United Airlines jetliners bound for California from Boston, Newark, and Washington Dulles. 2 of them going into the World Trade Center, 1 going into the Pentagon, and another crash landing and killing everyone on board outside of Pittsburgh. This was a well-planned, very cold-blooded, extremely well-executed terrorist attack, Robert, and we have been talking tonight about whether we'll have a resumption of air flight in this country anytime tomorrow. This is one more of the exceptional developments. No airplanes were flying after about noon today.
They were talking about resuming flights at noon tomorrow. They say at least that they'll reassess it at that point. And meantime, there's also some new information now that maybe the weapon of choice here seems to have been knives. We know now that there were knives involved on at least 3 of the 4 aircraft that were hijacked and brought down. And there's been no mention yet of anything about guns being used. But first, let's look at the facts of these crashes today.
The string of events that results in these 4 horrific crashes begins at Boston's Logan Airport, 7:45 a.m. American Flight 11, 767, with 92 on board, supposed to fly Boston to Los Angeles, but over New York State, it's diverted, forced to fly south, directly into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. A long day of carnage is underway. Back in Boston, United Flight 175, another 767, with 65 aboard, is already in the air, also bound for Los Angeles, 15 minutes behind the first flight, when it too is hijacked. This, the actual plane, as it hits the South Tower of the World Trade Center. 8:10 a.m., American Flight 77, a 757 with 64 aboard, has taken off from Washington's Dulles Airport, also bound for Los Angeles. It too, taken over and loops back into the Pentagon. It slices in at an angle, leaving a deadly and ugly gash in the nation's military nerve center. And finally, 8 a.m. out of Newark Airport, United's Flight 93, a 757 with 45 aboard, bound Newark to San Francisco, hijacked as well, but crashes short of whatever its intended target is, comes down in rural western Pennsylvania. Eyewitnesses there.
And I heard a loud noise, and I happened to look up, and it was a plane. It was real low to me. It sounded like it was running fine to me. I just kept watching. I watched it go nosedive straight into the ground.
You could see where the plane made the initial impact in the ground, and it was still on fire. It made a crater probably 30 feet by 30 feet, and it's probably 15 or 20 feet deep, and there's just debris scattered within probably a half-a-mile radius.
There are only 2 ways terrorists can sneak themselves or their weapons aboard planes, either through passenger screening or by going unscreened through locked doors into off-limits areas or onto the tarmac. Periodic FAA tests have found plenty of flaws. Found when government agents tried to sneak into secure areas, they were successful more than 2/3 of the time. Found testers also often able to sneak fake guns and explosives by X-ray screening. Once aboard, many speculate the hijackers must have disabled crews and taken over the plane's controls. More likely that than forcing a pilot with a gun at his head to fly right into the World Trade Center, for instance. Former American Airlines pilot Jim Tillman.
It is inconceivable to me that any airline pilot would allow anyone to force him to fly into an inhabited building. I cannot imagine how any pilot could be conscious or capable of doing anything to control that airplane at the time that it was directed at one of these buildings.
Terrorism specialist Neil Livingstone.
I suspect that what we're going to find is that the pilots were overwhelmed, perhaps dead already, and that trained pilots from the hijacker camp were in charge of those aircraft and were willing to die for their beliefs.
If there was time, if there was, the crews may have been able to press a button in the cockpit and send out a coded warning to controllers that there was a hijack in progress. Controllers may then have radioed back inquiries. But if the crews were disabled, the controllers would have been left in the dark for real information. Whatever else, controllers must have been surprised, in disbelief. There hadn't been a commercial plane hijacked in the U.S. for 10 years, since 1991. And now this.
And tonight we're getting reports of cell phone calls from at least 3 of those 4 flights, 1 from a flight attendant and 2 from passengers that were on board the flights. And they all talk about knives. There's, again, no mention of guns. In the first case, it was that flight that came out of Boston, and that was an American Airlines flight, and it was a flight attendant who apparently got a cell phone call off. I've heard variously it was to American Airlines operations or maybe somewhere else, but she reported that her fellow attendants had been stabbed in in the back of the plane, and that the cabin had been taken over, and up front that the crew of the plane had been taken over, and that the plane was going down in New York, was the quote that we heard. Then, on the second flight that came out of Boston, that was the second flight of the day, that was 17 minutes behind that first flight, and also went into one of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, there was a businessman who got off 2 cell phone calls to his father. In the first